Let's get more now on one of our top stories today. The Prime Minister's call for more clarity on what legal powers armed police have, as he backed a Home Office review after an unnamed officer was charged with murder over the shooting of Chris Cabba. Well, dozens of specialist officers have laid down their firearms, concerned that they could face prosecution too. I'm joined now by Tony Long. He's a former Metropolitan Police firearms officer who was cleared of murder in 2015 following the shooting of Azelle Rodney. Thanks so much for joining us, Tony, on this topic. First and foremost, what is it like to go through a charge of this nature when I guess you would see a similarity between the cases that you went through, where you feel like you're in fact carrying out your job, the job that you're doing to try and protect people?
Well, you summed it up there. That's exactly what you're trained to do. You do what you're trained to do, and then you're treated as if you've done something wrong. And I think that's the issue at the bottom of all of this.
Can you understand investigations taking place in general, follow-ups, etc.?
Armed police officers in the UK, to the last man or woman, are absolutely clear that if they are required to use ultimate force in the way that they've been trained to do, they will be scrutinised, and everyone accepts that. It's the length of the scrutiny and it's the unfairness in many respects of the way those investigations are conducted. I mean, I don't want to go on about my case because it's pretty historic now, but I shot someone in 2005 and I didn't stand trial until 2015. Now, there was lots of legal reasons for that, but a lot of that time that was taken was stuff that should have been dealt with much more swiftly. You know, the Commissioner, in his letter to the Home Secretary today, which is, I think, on the public forum now, it cites two cases, you know, where it's taken, in one case, two officers were charged, I think, with attempted murder. The investigation by the IOPC and the review of the evidence by the Crown Prosecution Service took well in excess of 3 years. And when they got to trial, the CPS offered no evidence. So that's 3 years where those officers have been having this hanging over their head. Their families are obviously seriously concerned about the implications of their husbands, or in this case, husbands potentially having to serve a prison sentence. And the officers can't understand why it takes, for instance, the IOPC to take the length of time it takes to do an investigation. So these are some of the problems that they face. And if you were to speak to any of the officers about the letter that the Commissioner has written and the points that he's raised about the problems within the system, every one of those police officers, every one of those authorised firearms officers would agree with what the Commissioner is saying. The problem is that we've been here before. Previous commissioners have offered to resolve these problems and haven't done so. And now the only reason that the Commissioner is pushing for things to go forward and for changes to be made to the system to make it fairer for police officers is because my former colleague, or my colleagues, current colleagues, have taken this action. And because they feel they've got no support whatsoever from Scotland Yard. And the very fact that the Commissioner is now sitting up and paying attention isn't because he has any particular interest in the welfare of firearms officers, or that's the way it appears. The only reason he's doing it is because basically they're volunteers, they've withdrawn their services because of their concerns, and he's left the situation where he's having to call in the military, and he's having to get much lesser trained officers to step up to do jobs that they're literally not trained to do. And at the same time, try and convince you all, the public, that no, it's business as usual. It isn't business as usual. The public in London are not as safe as they would be if armed response vehicles officers and counter-terrorist specialist firearms officers were being allowed to do their job.
I have no doubt about that. And I guess my follow-up question is whether, and we don't want to go into the details of the individual cases, but I guess this one has seen proceedings brought much quicker than the decade or so that you had to wait on. And it is by the CPS. So I guess my question is whether in hypothetical certain circumstance, if the evidence is overwhelming, you think it's fair that it gets into the hands of the CPS Or do you think there should be a different law for this that would protect it to internal police procedures, and you'd like to see the police leadership back their own more? Or do you think it's fine, hypothetically, in certain circumstances, for it to get to a potential murder charge, or that should be ruled out?
So let's get this straight. The powers that the police have to use reasonable force, and that the reasonableness of that force depends on the level of the threat. So if you've got a suicide bomber, clearly a reasonable thing to do is to shoot him in the head so that he can't detonate the bomb. That's one extreme. Another extreme is if a person's got a knife and you're able to use a less lethal option like a taser, that would be reasonable force. Or if you could struggle with somebody, that would be reasonable force. The reality is that power comes from Section 3 of the Criminal Law Act, and that says any person may use such forces as reasonable in the circumstances, in the prevention of crime, etc., etc., etc. So the police actually, with the exception of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act that gives some specific powers to police officers in conjunction with that act, but generally speaking, all the legislation that relates to use of force and reasonableness of force applies to every single member of the public, not just police officers. So police officers don't have any special powers to start with. Secondly, the Crown Prosecution Service looked at my case in 2006 after the Independent Police Complaints Commission, or whatever it was called at the time, decided that I'd acted lawfully, but still submitted the paperwork to the CPS for them to make a decision. It took 6 months or longer for the CPS to come to the conclusion that I indeed hadn't done anything. They put it in front of a Silk, who was, a very highly, regarded and ranked member of the legal system, and he decided that there was absolutely no evidence to substantiate any allegation that I'd done anything other than act in accordance with my training. And yet, 10 years later, in 2014 or thereabouts, they had another look at it as a result of a judge ruling that I'd acted unlawfully.
I'm very sorry, Tony. My sincere apologies. We are out of time, and I wish we had very much more, but we really thank you for your perspective.